Hey friends, thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's time travel back more than 1,000 years to see how a humble bean from the Ethiopian highlands brewed its way into the heart of the Abbasid Empire, ignited dazzling coffeehouses in Baghdad, and ultimately shaped global culture. In the next couple of hours, we'll trace coffee's journey across trade routes, peek inside those lively scroll-stacked cafes where scholars and poets debated into the night, and discover how this fragrant drink fueled revolutions of science, art and politics, right up to its modern role as the world's favourite creative catalyst. Picture the Tigris River winds through the city of the Abbasid Empire, Baghdad, its waters reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun. On its banks, merchant ships dock, unloading crates of silk, spices and rare gemstones from far-off lands. The river's flow is steady and constant, much like the exchange of knowledge and ideas in Baghdad. The city's bridges connect the east and west of the empire, and boats ferry goods and thinkers alike, linking cultures and intellectual traditions. Baghdad has become the meeting point for minds from all corners of the world. Persians, Arabs, Greeks, Indians and others who have come to share their knowledge, their stories and their discoveries. But amidst the grandeur of royal courts, libraries and academies, there exists something far less formal yet equally profound: the coffeehouses. These small, unpretentious establishments scattered across the city streets offer a place of gathering for those who seek more than just a drink. They seek conversation, debate, and intellectual exchange. As you step into one of these bustling coffeehouses, you're greeted by the warmth of the room, the gentle flicker of oil lamps casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the heady aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The scent is intoxicating, a rich, earthy fragrance that promises both comfort and stimulation. The sound of gentle conversation and the clink of ceramic cups on wooden tables fills the space, creating a soft, rhythmic hum that accompanies the lively debates taking place around you. The coffee houses are informal, much more relaxed than the formality of royal courts or the solemnity of religious institutions, yet they are spaces that foster a different kind of intellectual energy. One where ideas can flow freely and be tested without the restrictions of social rank or political power. The coffeehouse is where intellectuals and thinkers from all walks of life, scholars, poets, artists, merchants and travellers, come together to share their ideas. A philosopher might sit beside a poet, a scientist next to a merchant, and all are welcome to speak, to question, to engage in the great conversation that is unfolding before them. This is a space where the rigid hierarchies of society seem to melt away, where a merchant's perspective is as valuable as that of a scholar, where the debate about the nature of the stars is as important as a conversation about the latest trade routes. The coffeehouse serves as a perfect microcosm of Baghdad itself, a place of diversity, ideas and cultural exchange. Here, the intellectual pulse of the city beats loud and clear. The conversations that take place in these humble spaces are far-reaching, touching on philosophy, science, literature and politics. As you listen, you hear debates about the nature of the universe, the role of government, the meaning of poetry, and the latest developments in mathematics. It is in this space that thinkers are not just consuming knowledge, they are creating it. They are testing ideas, challenging one another, and forging new paths of thought that will shape the world for centuries to come. This is the scene before you. The coffeehouse, a simple yet profound institution, providing a space for ideas to flourish and minds to connect. In this small, informal setting, the seeds of intellectual revolution are being sown, and the very foundations of modern thought are beginning to take shape. The coffeehouse, humble as it may seem, will become a place where intellectuals of all kinds come together, sparking debates that will spread far beyond the walls of this unassuming establishment and change the course of history. Before the coffeehouse emerged as a focal point of intellectual exchange in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Mecca, the cultural and intellectual landscape was dominated by a much more formal structure, one where knowledge was largely confined to elite academic circles, royal courts, and religious institutions. The exchange of ideas, while vibrant and rich, was constrained by rigid social hierarchies, class distinctions, and political boundaries. Scholars and intellectuals were often isolated in academic halls or in the service of royal courts, where their work was shaped by the tastes and interests of their patrons. In the royal courts, intellectual life was deeply intertwined with politics. The rulers, often patrons of the arts and sciences, held considerable influence over the direction of intellectual thought. These powerful individuals often shaped the discourse by controlling the flow of knowledge, determining which ideas were allowed to flourish and which were suppressed. Scholars would present their works in these courts, often bending to the desires of the rulers or the religious authorities who dominated the intellectual sphere. While this environment allowed for the flourishing of certain fields, it also stifled dissent in ideas and marginalised the voices of those outside the courtly elite. Similarly, religious institutions, while invaluable to the preservation of knowledge and tradition, also exerted a strong influence over the intellectual climate. The Islamic Golden Age was marked by incredible advancements in fields like mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, much of which was influenced by the writings of ancient Greek philosophers and scholars. Yet the theological interpretations of the time often had a stronghold on what could and could not be discussed. Scholars had to navigate the complex relationship between faith and reason, and many of the more radical ideas were left unspoken or hidden in the shadows. Religious orthodoxy, while contributing to the richness of the intellectual life, sometimes curbed intellectual exploration, particularly in areas like philosophy, where questioning the nature of God or the universe could lead to accusations of heresy. Academic institutions like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad were undoubtedly centres of knowledge and intellectual progress. They housed the works of scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond, where translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were preserved and studied. However, these institutions were often elitist in nature, accessible only to those of a high social status, wealth, or political favour. Access to the most revered texts was limited, and much of the intellectual discourse that occurred in these spaces was constrained by political and religious influences. The world outside of these institutions was largely disconnected from intellectual pursuits. The merchant class, for example, though wealthy and influential, had little access to the scholarly conversations taking place within the elite circles. Their knowledge was practical, acquired through experience rather than formal education, and while essential to the functioning of the empire, it was often not valued in the same way as academic or theological knowledge. The same could be said for artists and poets, who were often regarded as entertainers rather than intellectuals. There was a sharp divide between those who had access to formal knowledge and those who did not, and the flow of ideas was in many ways restricted to a select few. However, the intellectual climate of the time was undeniably rich with potential. There was an undeniable thirst for knowledge, an energy that lay beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to break free. Scholars and thinkers longed for a space where they could share their ideas freely, where they could be challenged and inspired by others from all walks of life. It was a time when the old paradigms were being questioned, when new ideas about science, philosophy and religion were bubbling to the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And the coffee house, in its humble yet transformative way, would become the perfect space for this intellectual revolution to take place. In the absence of such informal spaces, ideas often went unheard. The voices of the common people, traders, artisans, poets, and farmers were silenced in the face of the intellectual elite. These voices, while just as important to the fabric of society, had no venue in which to challenge the prevailing ideas of the time. The coffee house would provide this space, a public forum where ideas could flow freely. where intellectuals of all kinds could gather to exchange knowledge, debate theories, and test new ideas. The coffee house would be a radical departure from the formal intellectual spaces that dominated the era. It would create a new space for thinkers to come together, regardless of their social standing or intellectual background. It was here that the seeds of innovation would be sown, seeds that would grow into a movement that transcended the boundaries of the elite and reached the common people. The coffee house was set to become a new kind of intellectual arena, one where ideas could be tested, refined, and spread far beyond the walls of the royal court or religious institution. It would be a space for everyone, a place where intellectual democracy could truly take root. The journey of coffee, from its humble beginnings in the highlands of Ethiopia to its transformative role in the intellectual life of the Islamic world, is not just the story of a beverage. It is the tale of an idea, a substance, and a cultural force that would shape societies for centuries. The origins of coffee are shrouded in mystery, with folklore and legend weaving the first chapters of its journey. In the 9th century, a young Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi made the discovery that would change the world. Kaldi noticed that his goats, after consuming the red cherries of a particular tree, became unusually energetic, prancing and jumping with a vitality they hadn't shown before. Curious about this strange behaviour, Kaldi tried the berries himself, experiencing a surge of energy that kept him awake and alert. Excited by his find, Kaldi shared his discovery with a local monk, who, intrigued by the effects, brewed a drink from the cherries. The monk found that the beverage helped him stay awake during the long hours of prayer and meditation. This marked the beginning of coffee's association with mental clarity and alertness, a characteristic that would soon make it indispensable to intellectuals, thinkers, and religious figures alike. As word spread about this powerful berry, it wasn't long before coffee's energizing effects were embraced across Ethiopia. Coffee began to be brewed not just for staying awake during prayer, but for its ability to fuel discussions, creative thoughts, and deeper engagement with the world around them. From Ethiopia, coffee began its gradual migration across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. The first major step of coffee's journey into the broader Islamic world was its arrival in Yemen, in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen, a crucial stop along the trade routes between Africa and the Middle East, became the first region to cultivate coffee on a large scale. The warm climate of Yemen was ideal for growing the coffee plant, and the beverage quickly became a vital part of the daily routine for the people there. While coffee was initially popular with Sufi mystics, who brewed it to stay awake during their devotions, its use spread beyond religious circles to the wider population. Yemen's role as the birthplace of coffee's broader cultural journey would be key in its integration into the social and intellectual fabric of the Arab world. From Yemen, coffee's influence expanded further into the rest of the Islamic world. The bustling cities of Mecca and Medina, already famous for their religious significance and as destinations for pilgrims, became the next destinations for coffee's spread. Mecca, a city constantly in flux with the arrival of pilgrims, merchants and travellers from far and wide, became the perfect environment for the exchange of ideas, and coffee was the perfect companion to fuel those exchanges. As pilgrims passed through the city, they brought coffee with them, introducing it to traders, intellectuals and artists from across the empire. By the time coffee reached the larger, more cosmopolitan cities like Cairo and Baghdad, its use had evolved. No longer confined to religious circles, it had become a beverage that connected people from all walks of life. Scholars in Cairo, inspired by coffee's ability to enhance focus and stimulate the mind, began to incorporate it into their study routines. As the beverage gained popularity, the first coffee houses began to emerge in these urban centres. These early coffee houses were simple establishments, modest in design but potent in their ability to foster intellectual exchange. People would gather in these spaces to drink coffee, of course, but more importantly to share ideas, discuss the latest intellectual trends, and debate matters of science, religion, and philosophy. The first coffee houses were informal places, with little more than basic wooden benches and tables, but their impact was profound. It was here that thinkers of various disciplines, such as philosophers, poets, mathematicians, and scientists, could meet and exchange ideas in a public democratic space. This was a significant departure from the intellectual environments of royal courts and religious institutions, where knowledge was often restricted to the elites. Coffee houses provided a space where ordinary people, merchants, artisans, travellers, could engage with scholars, share knowledge, and participate in the intellectual discourse of the day. It was this accessibility that made the coffee house so unique and powerful, and it would go on to shape the intellectual culture of the Islamic world in ways that had never been imagined before. As the coffee house grew in popularity across the Islamic world, coffee's influence spread beyond intellectual circles into the realm of art and culture. Artists and poets, inspired by the creativity that coffee seemed to fuel, found new ways to express themselves in this open, stimulating environment. Poets began to compose and recite their verses in coffee houses, while artists sought inspiration from the vibrant discussions that filled the air. These coffee houses soon became cultural hubs, where ideas flowed as freely as the coffee itself. The arrival of coffee in the bustling cities of the Arabian Peninsula marked a profound turning point in its journey from a simple herbal stimulant to a cultural and intellectual phenomenon. The earliest coffee houses in Mecca, one of the most sacred cities in the Islamic world, became the unlikely birthplace for a revolution in intellectual and social life. Mecca, already a hub for religious pilgrimage, trade and culture, was an ideal location for coffee to take root. Pilgrims and travellers from distant lands would pour into the city, bringing new ideas, goods and traditions. Among these was the intoxicating brew of coffee, which quickly became part of the city's dynamic intellectual and social fabric. In the early 15th century, coffee made its first significant impact in Mecca, where it was initially embraced by religious mystics, particularly the Sufi orders. The Sufis, known for their rigorous spiritual practices, often spent long hours in prayer and meditation. They found that coffee, with its stimulating properties, helped them maintain focus during their nocturnal vigils. The beverage became so closely associated with their spiritual practices that, at one point, it was forbidden by religious authorities who feared that it might encourage revelry and distraction during prayer. Despite initial resistance, coffee's influence spread like wildfire throughout Mecca. It wasn't long before the practice of brewing and drinking coffee began to take root in other segments of society. As coffee became more widely accepted, it grew beyond religious circles and began to weave itself into the social life of the city. Coffee houses, simple but welcoming, began to emerge as places for social gathering, intellectual exchange, and debate. In these early coffee houses, the streets of Mecca were transformed into informal venues for scholars, poets, and artists to engage in spirited discussions and share their ideas with one another. As coffee houses began to thrive in Mecca, the influence of this humble drink spread to other major cities in the Arab world, most notably Cairo. Cairo, a great intellectual and cultural centre in the Islamic world, was the perfect place for coffee to take on a life of its own. The city's bustling markets, libraries and madrasas, schools, created a fertile environment for coffee houses to flourish. Like Mecca, Cairo's coffee houses were initially modest spaces, often nothing more than small, dimly lit rooms with low tables, comfortable cushions, and the constant sound of lively conversation. In Cairo, coffee houses soon became venues not only for socialization, but also for intellectual exchange. Here, scholars and poets could meet freely, far from the constraints of royal courts or formal academic settings. The coffee house became a space where ideas flowed as freely as the coffee itself, fostering a new kind of intellectual freedom and creativity that had never before existed in such a public setting. The conversations taking place in Cairo's coffee houses range from the philosophical to the political, from the artistic to the scientific. It was here that mathematicians discussed new theories, poets recited their verses, and merchants shared stories from the farthest reaches of the empire. Cairo's coffeehouses, in particular, were crucial to the development of a more accessible intellectual culture. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures of royal courts or the religious schools, the coffeehouse allowed for a truly democratic exchange of ideas. The coffeehouse was open to anyone, from the lowest merchant to the most respected scholar. In this informal space, scholars could sit side by side with merchants, artists, and even travellers passing through the city, all contributing to the exchange of ideas. The intellectual cross-pollination that took place here was unprecedented. Ideas from Persia, India, and the ancient Greeks could be debated, challenged, and expanded upon, all in the same room. The spread of coffeehouses throughout the Arab world was not limited to Mecca and Cairo. Cities like Damascus and Istanbul began to embrace the coffeehouse culture as well, and the intellectual and social dynamics that developed in these spaces began to shape the broader landscape of the Islamic world. Istanbul, as the imperial capital of the Ottoman Empire, became a vibrant centre of coffeehouse culture where poets, philosophers, and political thinkers could meet, exchange ideas, and discuss the future of the empire. These early coffeehouses across the Arab world had a profound impact on the way people engaged with ideas and culture. They were not merely places to relax and drink coffee. They were centres of intellectual ferment, where new ideas could be tested, challenged, and refined. In the coffeehouse, the boundaries between different social classes, intellectual disciplines, and political ideologies blurred, creating an open space for free thought. This was a space where anyone could contribute their voice, where ideas could be shared without the restrictions imposed by the formalities of academic institutions or the rigid structures of royal patronage. Coffeehouses in cities like Mecca and Cairo became the breeding grounds for new intellectual movements. The exchange of ideas and information was accelerated, and intellectuals found in the coffeehouse a new kind of venue for collaboration. The coffeehouse was, in many ways, a reflection of the broader cultural and intellectual openness that was emerging in the Islamic world, an openness that would lay the groundwork for centuries of intellectual progress and cultural exchange. As coffee made its way into the heart of the Islamic world, it began to transform from a simple beverage consumed by religious figures and intellectuals into a social catalyst that would redefine public spaces. The first coffee houses were modest, humble establishments that could be found on the bustling streets of Mecca, Cairo, and later Baghdad and Istanbul. These small, often nondescript venues were the birthplace of a new intellectual culture, a place where ideas could flow freely and minds could meet to discuss philosophy, politics, and the arts. They would become far more than just places where coffee was brewed. They would become vibrant centres of conversation, creativity, and intellectual ferment. The early coffee houses were simple in design. Small rooms with low wooden tables, comfortable cushions lining the walls, and a warm brazier in the corner. The space was intimate, often dimly lit by oil lamps or candles, which added a sense of quiet contemplation to the air. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavily in the air, adding to the sense of relaxation and focus. It was here, in these humble spaces, that the great debates of the day would unfold. At first, coffee houses were places for the everyday person to gather, sip a drink and take a break from the busy pace of life. However, as coffee grew in popularity, these simple gathering spots began to attract a wide range of individuals, from intellectuals and poets to merchants and travellers. Unlike the more formal, restricted spaces of royal courts or religious institutions, the coffeehouse was open to all. This accessibility made the coffeehouse a revolutionary space, where ideas were exchanged freely across social, political, and intellectual boundaries. The conversations in these early coffeehouses were wide-ranging, touching on every aspect of life. Intellectuals came to debate new discoveries in science and philosophy, while poets shared their latest verses, and merchants exchanged news from faraway lands. In the coffee house, thinkers from different backgrounds and disciplines could meet, mingle, and engage in deep discussions. The humble setting of the coffee house was the perfect backdrop for these intellectual exchanges. Relaxed, informal, and free from the strict formalities that often accompanied more official spaces of learning. In Mecca and Cairo, the coffee house quickly became a crucial part of the intellectual landscape. It was here that religious leaders and scholars gathered to discuss the great theological and philosophical questions of the time, far from the rigid control of religious institutions. It was also here that the first political discussions were held, sometimes openly challenging the established power structures of the day. While coffee houses were not meant to be places of direct political dissent, they often became spaces where people could air grievances, share news of political uprisings, or debate matters of governance. The coffee house also provided a fertile ground for the exchange of artistic and literary ideas. In a world where poetry and music were highly valued, coffee houses became the ideal venue for poets to recite their works and share them with an eager audience. Some of the most celebrated poets of the time, such as Abu Nuwas and Al-Mutanabbi, frequented these coffee houses, performing their verses before an audience of intellectuals and ordinary citizens alike. These public recitations allowed poetry to reach a wider audience and ensured that the voice of the poet was heard by all, not just the elite. As the coffeehouse culture spread, the first professional entertainers, musicians, storytellers, and comedians found a home in these spaces as well. The lively atmosphere of the coffeehouse, combined with the stimulating effects of coffee, encouraged creativity and artistic expression. Performers often took advantage of the social and intellectual energy of the coffeehouse to hone their craft and engage with new audiences. Despite their humble beginnings, the coffeehouses were becoming places of tremendous cultural and intellectual significance. They were spaces where new ideas could be explored and tested in real time, where the boundaries of knowledge and expression could be stretched. The coffeehouse had become a democratizing force in intellectual life, open to everyone, regardless of their social class or profession. In this informal setting, ideas from all corners of society could meet, clash, and collaborate, leading to the emergence of new ways of thinking that would influence future generations. Over time, the coffeehouse became a symbol of intellectual freedom and public discourse. In places like Cairo and Mecca, where the elite often controlled access to knowledge, the coffeehouse provided a space where anyone with an idea could contribute to the conversation. The informal nature of the coffeehouse, combined with the stimulating effects of coffee, made it an ideal space for the kind of intellectual exploration that would define the Islamic Golden Age. As the coffeehouses of the Arab world continued to grow in popularity, they quickly evolved from simple gathering spots into vibrant centres of intellectual, artistic, and social exchange. No longer just places to sip a beverage and relax, these coffeehouses became critical hubs where ideas were exchanged, debates were sparked, and new movements of thought emerged. What started as humble venues serving coffee to weary travellers soon became the beating heart of the intellectual and cultural life of the cities. The transformation of coffee houses into cultural and intellectual centres was largely due to the environment they created, an environment that was open, informal, and inclusive. Unlike the elite academic institutions or royal courts, which were often restricted to those of high social status or political power, coffee houses were spaces where anyone could come, sit, and contribute. Whether you were a poet, a scholar, a merchant, or an artisan, the coffeehouse offered an egalitarian platform where ideas were freely exchanged, discussed, and refined. In this way, the coffeehouse became the ideal venue for intellectual discourse. The relaxed atmosphere of the coffeehouse encouraged spontaneous and free-flowing conversations. The coffee itself played a central role in this. It was a beverage that not only awakened the mind, but also created a sense of camaraderie among those who shared it. As people gathered to drink coffee, they also gathered to discuss the great questions of the day, whether it was the latest discoveries in astronomy, philosophical debates about the nature of existence, or the political issues that shaped their world. the exchange of ideas was not limited by formal structure, and everyone was welcome to contribute their voice, making it a true public forum. These spaces became particularly important during a time when access to knowledge was still largely controlled by institutions of power. The coffee house, in its very design, broke down those barriers. Anyone who entered could engage in the conversations, regardless of their social rank or background. A scholar from the great academic centres could sit next to a merchant who had travelled through distant lands, and they could both exchange their ideas freely, without the constraints of academic formalities or social hierarchy. It was in this mixing of different perspectives that the true intellectual energy of the coffeehouse emerged. Moreover, coffeehouses became the places where the issues of the day were discussed, with a sense of urgency and passion. Political debates, in particular, found a fertile ground here. While the royal courts and religious institutions had their own sanctioned views on governance, in the coffee house citizens could speak more freely. Discussions about the role of government, the nature of power, and the responsibilities of rulers were held with vigour and at times dissent. The intellectual freedom of the coffee house made it a space where the ideas of reform, revolution, and change could be voiced, even if they ran counter to the official positions of the ruling elite. Beyond politics, coffeehouses were also centres of artistic and cultural exchange. Poets and writers, inspired by the energy of the space and the social interactions they witnessed, often came to perform their work before an audience. The verses of the poets would echo through the rooms, their words captured by listeners who were eager to engage with the arts and culture of their time. In fact, the coffeehouse served as a kind of informal stage for the performance of poetry, storytelling, and music. These performances weren't just entertainment, they were part of the intellectual landscape of the time, challenging conventions and sparking new ideas. In addition to literary works, the coffeehouse became a place where new ideas about art, music, and culture could be discussed. Painters and artists too found inspiration in the conversations that swirled around them. The intellectual freedom and openness of the coffeehouse allowed for the exchange of creative ideas that transcended formal artistic institutions. The coffeehouse became a space where the arts and intellectual pursuits were no longer confined to the elite or the formalised spaces of royal patronage. Instead, it became a place where ordinary people could engage with the works of poets and artists, challenge those works, and contribute their own ideas about what art should be. Coffee houses also provided a unique social function in that they were gathering places where people from all walks of life could meet. It was here that you could find a scholar debating with a merchant, a poet conversing with a politician, or a theologian engaging with a scientist. This mixing of social classes and intellectual traditions created a dynamic, collaborative atmosphere that was unlike anything else in the formal institutions of the time. The coffee house was a microcosm of society, diverse, open, and always evolving. It was here that the intellectual and artistic ideas that would shape the future of the region were born, tested, and refined. As the coffee house became more ingrained in the fabric of social and intellectual life, it also began to play a significant role in the development of new intellectual movements. The early coffee houses in cities like Cairo, Mecca, and Baghdad were crucial to the intellectual movements that emerged during the Islamic Golden Age. Here, the great minds of the time could share their latest findings and engage in rigorous debate with their peers. In these spaces, the seeds of the intellectual revolutions that would later spread to Europe and beyond were sown. The coffee house, then, was not just a place to drink coffee. It was a catalyst for intellectual growth, a breeding ground for artistic creativity, and a space where political and social ideas could be challenged and developed. As coffee houses flourished, they would become integral to the cultural and intellectual life of the Arab world, laying the foundation for the exchange of ideas that would shape the future of humanity. The coffee house in 9th century Baghdad, Mecca, Cairo, and beyond wasn't just a social gathering spot. It was a microcosm of the intellectual and cultural landscape of the Islamic world. Within the warm walls of these informal, humble spaces, a diverse range of topics was discussed, debated, and often contested. The very act of gathering over coffee created an environment conducive to free thought, reflection, and exchange, one that transcended the limits of royal courts and formal institutions. One of the most compelling aspects of the coffee house was its intellectual diversity. Here, the great thinkers of the time could meet and discuss complex ideas, but just as often they could engage with those outside their intellectual circles, traders, poets, artisans, and travellers. This created a fertile ground for the cross-pollination of ideas from different walks of life, each conversation bringing something fresh and new to the table. At the heart of many discussions was philosophy, the discipline that sought to understand the nature of existence, morality, and the cosmos. Coffeehouse conversations were often filled with lively debates about the works of ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, whose ideas had been preserved and translated into Arabic by scholars in the House of Wisdom and other intellectual centres. The great minds of the time, like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, were frequently found in these spaces, expanding upon Greek philosophy and introducing their interpretations of logic, ethics, and metaphysics. The coffee house was an intellectual arena where scholars could challenge each other's ideas on the nature of knowledge, the mind-body relationship, and the existence of the divine. These were no dry theoretical discussions, but were vibrant and engaging conversations that delved into the very core of human existence and the universe. Al-Ghazali, for example, whose thoughts on mysticism and philosophy would later challenge the philosophical dominance of figures like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, would have found in the coffee house a place where his ideas could be tested and refined in a very public, open setting. It was in these coffee houses that debates about the relationship between faith and reason were often at their most intense. While the courtly intellectuals and religious scholars may have adhered to more rigid structures of thought, the coffee house provided a space where ideas could flow freely and where different schools of thought, Islamic, Greek and Persian, could collide and synthesize. Alongside philosophy, political theory was also a major topic of discussion. Coffee houses became the breeding ground for debates on governance, justice, and the role of power. In an era when royal courts often restricted the flow of ideas, the coffee house became an unofficial forum for political dialogue. Whether it was the nature of the caliphate, the role of the ruler, or the relationship between rulers and their subjects, these conversations could be both spirited and subversive. Scholars and thinkers, as well as ordinary citizens, would meet to discuss the latest political events, often drawing on their own experiences as traders, travellers, or residents of Baghdad, Mecca, or Cairo. These were not just theoretical conversations about political systems. They were deeply connected to the lived realities of the people. For example, debates about the legitimacy of the caliphate or the nature of political power could easily evolve into critiques of the political system, challenging the power dynamics at the very heart of the empire. Unlike the official political institutions, where discourse was often dictated by rulers or political elites, the coffee house allowed a far more diverse range of opinions to emerge. Thinkers like Ibn Khaldun, whose groundbreaking theories on the rise and fall of civilizations would shape future historical thought, would have found the coffee house an ideal space to engage with others on the dynamics of power, state building, and social structures. The political conversations in coffee houses often addressed real pressing issues, like the consolidation of power by rulers, the governance of empires, and the role of religion in politics. Literature, too, found a thriving home in the coffee house. Poets, the heart of the Arab world's rich literary tradition, would come to share their verses, recite their latest works, and engage in public readings. The coffee house was a natural stage for the performance of poetry, and poets would frequently use it to gauge the reactions of their audiences, fine-tuning their works based on the feedback they received from fellow coffeehouse patrons. It wasn't uncommon for poets to publicly challenge one another's work, adding an element of healthy rivalry to the intellectual energy of the coffee house. Poets like Abu Nuwas, known for his bold, sometimes controversial poetry, would often challenge societal norms and use their verses to question the status quo, whether the topic was the nature of love, politics, or religion. Poetry in the coffee house became a vehicle for addressing the great issues of the day. For example, Al-Mutanabbi, one of the most famous poets of the Arab world, would have shared his poignant reflections on power, heroism, and personal identity in these spaces, allowing his poetry to spark conversations about leadership and the human condition. Moreover, literature and poetry in the coffee house weren't just confined to classical forms. The coffee house also nurtured the development of newer literary forms and encouraged greater experimentation with both content and structure. Writers could engage with one another about how stories should be told, how language could be used to evoke deeper meanings, and how the written word could influence society. Religion, as one of the defining aspects of daily life in the Islamic world, naturally also played a central role in coffeehouse discussions. Religious scholars, mystics, and intellectuals would gather to debate interpretations of the Quran, Hadith, and other religious texts. These discussions were not limited to orthodox views. The coffee house also provided a space for more radical interpretations of Islam, as well as for more mystically inclined thinkers like the Sufis, who would regularly meet in these spaces to discuss their spiritual practices. Religious debates often blended with the more philosophical discussions taking place. For example, thinkers would debate the relationship between faith and reason, discussing how Islamic teachings could be reconciled with the growing body of knowledge coming from Greek philosophy and scientific inquiry. It was in this space, free from the control of religious authorities, that intellectuals could question, explore, and sometimes even challenge the established doctrines of the time. The early coffee houses of the Islamic world were not simply gathering spots. They were vibrant centres where some of the greatest intellectual minds of the time would meet, exchange ideas, and influence the development of culture and knowledge. These spaces attracted thinkers from all walks of life, philosophers, poets, scientists, and artists, whose contributions helped shape the course of history. They provided an opportunity for individuals to test their ideas in a dynamic public setting, where anyone, regardless of their social status, could participate in the discussion. Among the most notable figures who frequented these early coffee houses were scholars and philosophers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. These thinkers were pivotal in blending Greek philosophical traditions with Islamic thought, and their works laid the foundation for many of the intellectual debates that would take place in the coffee houses. Al-Farabi, for instance, known as the second teacher after Aristotle, played a central role in integrating Aristotelian logic into Islamic philosophy. His ideas about the ideal state and the philosopher king were often discussed in coffee houses, where scholars would debate and refine these concepts, bringing them to new levels of intellectual rigour. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, a polymath whose influence spanned across many fields, from medicine to philosophy, also frequented these spaces. His Canon of Medicine became one of the most influential medical texts in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. While Ibn Sina's works were highly academic, the coffee house environment provided a space for his ideas to be debated in less formal settings. It allowed for new interpretations and critiques to emerge, facilitating the spread of his revolutionary thoughts on human health, metaphysics, and logic. Ibn Rushd Averroes, whose work sought to reconcile the ideas of Aristotle with Islamic teachings, was another key intellectual who would have been drawn to the coffee houses. His writings on reason, religion, and philosophy made waves in both the Islamic world and later in medieval Europe. The coffeehouse setting, with its open exchange of ideas, provided the perfect space for his theories to be debated, challenged, and refined by other thinkers. Poets too played an essential role in these intellectual circles. Figures like Abu Nuwas and Al-Mutanabbi, whose works resonated deeply with the culture of the time, would have found in the coffeehouse an audience eager to engage with their art. Poetry in the coffeehouse was not just an entertainment, it was a vehicle for social and intellectual commentary. Abu Nuwas, known for his bold, often controversial works, pushed the boundaries of poetic expression by addressing themes of love, beauty, and even defiance of conventional morality. His performances in coffeehouses were not just artistic displays, but also invitations for deeper conversations about the nature of desire, freedom, and societal norms. Al-Mutanabi, whose poetry centered around themes of heroism, power, and destiny, would have also found the coffeehouse a vital space for sharing his works. His verses were deeply connected to political and philosophical ideas, and the coffeehouse setting allowed him to engage in the broader cultural debates of the time. The coffeehouse environment encouraged open discussion and provided a platform for poetry to meet philosophy and politics, creating a space where art could influence thought and vice versa. In addition to poets and philosophers, the coffeehouses attracted scientists and mathematicians who contributed to the rapid advancements in these fields. Al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician who is often credited with the development of algebra, would have found the coffeehouse a valuable space for discussing his groundbreaking work. His writings on algorithms, which laid the foundation for future mathematical developments, would have been shared and tested in these intellectual spaces. Coffeehouse discussions helped to refine and spread his theories, bringing them to a wider audience and allowing for more collaborative advancements in mathematics. Astronomers like al-Battani, whose precise observations of the heavens had a significant influence on later astronomy, also frequented these venues. His discussions about the movement of celestial bodies and the development of astronomical instruments were central to the intellectual exchanges that took place in the coffeehouses. These informal spaces, where scientific ideas could be discussed without the constraints of academia, allowed for the cross-pollination of ideas between different fields and encouraged the development of new theories and methodologies. The coffeehouse was also a hub for political thinkers who explored ideas about governance, justice, and the role of rulers in society. The informal nature of the coffeehouse allowed for more radical ideas to emerge, ideas that might have been suppressed in more formal settings. Political dissidents and intellectuals who felt constrained by the official institutions of power found in the coffeehouse a space where they could engage with others, share their views, and challenge the prevailing political order. These spaces became a breeding ground for political thought, where ideas about the nature of the state, the rights of individuals, and the responsibilities of rulers were debated in the open. The diverse mix of thinkers, poets, scientists, and political theorists created a rich intellectual environment in the coffeehouse, one that transcended the traditional boundaries of formal education and social rank. The open exchange of ideas was not restricted to one discipline or one group of people. It was a space where minds from all backgrounds could meet, engage, and grow. These intellectual exchanges, often heated but always respectful, played a crucial role in the development of the intellectual culture of the time, and the coffeehouse became a symbol of the free flow of thought, where the greatest ideas could emerge, challenge one another, and ultimately shape the future. The coffeehouses of the Islamic world became much more than casual gathering spaces. They quickly evolved into dynamic hubs for political discourse. These informal yet powerful venues allowed people from all walks of life, intellectuals, merchants, artisans, and even common citizens, to openly discuss the issues of governance, the legitimacy of rulers, and the rights of individuals. What made the coffeehouse particularly significant was its ability to democratize political discussion. Unlike royal courts or religious institutions, where political dialogue was typically restricted to the elites, the coffeehouse was a space where anyone could contribute their voice, making it a uniquely accessible platform for political ideas. In the coffeehouse, political discussions were not limited to abstract theories or philosophical ideals. These were deeply practical conversations, often shaped by the current events of the time. Whether it was a new political uprising, a challenge to the legitimacy of the caliph, or the latest reform in governance, these discussions were rooted in the realities of the political world. The coffeehouse became a place where ordinary citizens could speak freely about their concerns. Debates about governance were conducted openly, and intellectuals could test their political theories against the experiences of the people. The nature of these conversations also made the coffee house a fertile ground for political dissent. While the royal courts and religious institutions were spaces of control, the coffee house allowed for more freedom of expression. Here, individuals who were dissatisfied with the ruling regime could share their frustrations, critique the policies of the rulers, and propose alternatives. In this open forum, ideas that might have been censored or suppressed in other venues could flourish. Political thinkers, philosophers, and even ordinary citizens could voice their opinions without fear of immediate reprisal. This made the coffee house a significant space for intellectual and political resistance. As the coffeehouse culture spread, these spaces also became breeding grounds for political movements. When ideas about reform, justice, and the rights of the people took root in the coffeehouse, they could quickly spread through the network of intellectuals and activists who frequented these spaces. The coffeehouse allowed for the quick exchange of ideas, which facilitated the organisation of political thought and, in some cases, political action. As much as the coffeehouse was a place for intellectual discourse, it was also a platform for discussing the realities of power, governance, and society in a way that could shape political action. The influence of the coffeehouse in political discourse was not only about the exchange of ideas, it was also about the dissemination of news. Merchants, travellers, and scholars would bring information from different parts of the empire, spreading news about political developments, social unrest, or changes in leadership. These news reports, when shared in the coffeehouse, sparked discussions about the implications of these events for the political landscape. The coffeehouse, in this way, became a central node in the flow of information, helping to create a more informed public that could engage critically with the actions of their rulers. Despite the freedoms coffeehouses offered, they were not without their dangers for rulers. The open political discussions taking place in these informal spaces were often seen as a threat to the established order. The very act of discussing political change, questioning the legitimacy of the ruling power, critiquing policies, and debating the nature of justice was at times viewed as subversive. As a result, some rulers sought to suppress the coffeehouses, fearing that they could become hotbeds of rebellion and unrest. Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire, for instance, banned coffeehouses in 1633, seeing them as breeding grounds for political dissent. Despite such attempts to control the spread of ideas, the coffeehouse continued to thrive, reflecting its deep-rooted importance in the social and intellectual fabric of the cities. Even when coffeehouses were targeted by political authorities, they proved resilient. The demand for these spaces was so strong that, despite official bans or restrictions, coffeehouses would often reappear under new guises. This resilience reflected the importance of these spaces in the intellectual and political life of the region. The coffeehouse was more than just a place to drink coffee. It was a symbol of the free exchange of ideas, a site where new political, social, and intellectual movements could take root and challenge the status quo. In this sense, the coffeehouse was not merely a passive venue for discourse. It was a political tool, a space where ideas about justice, governance, and the role of the individual could be tested, refined, and ultimately spread throughout society. The intellectual debates that took place in the coffeehouses, often sparked by a cup of coffee, contributed to the development of political thought in ways that would influence not only the future of the Islamic world, but also the broader course of history. The role of coffeehouses in the Abbasid Empire was both subtle and profound. These simple spaces became integral to the intellectual and social life of Baghdad and other major cities under Abbasid rule. At the heart of the empire, Baghdad was not just a political capital, it was a thriving cultural and intellectual hub. The Abbasid caliphs, in their quest to elevate their empire, fostered an environment where scholars, scientists, poets, and philosophers could flourish. It was during this period that the House of Wisdom, one of the most renowned centres of learning, was established. Yet, beyond the walls of grand libraries and universities, coffeehouses became indispensable in shaping the intellectual culture of the empire. While the formal institutions of the Abbasid period were designed to support religious scholarship, law, and governance, coffeehouses offered a space for more spontaneous intellectual exchange. In these informal settings, the elite mingled with the common folk, exchanging ideas in a way that would have been unthinkable in the more rigidly structured spaces of the academy or royal court. The coffeehouse was not bound by the strict hierarchies of knowledge and power. It was a space where anyone, from the highest scholar to the humblest merchant, could contribute their thoughts and engage in discussion. In Baghdad, the coffeehouse became the place where the fruits of the great translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge were tested and debated. The scholars who had translated the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy into Arabic did not just copy these ancient texts. They engaged with them, debated their implications, and expanded upon them. These debates found a natural home in the coffeehouse. Intellectuals who had studied in the libraries of the House of Wisdom, like Al-Khwarizmi and Ibn Sina, would have joined with their peers in the coffeehouse to discuss the latest discoveries in mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. These spaces allowed for intellectual cross-pollination that helped shape the remarkable scientific and philosophical advancements of the Islamic Golden Age. What was particularly important about the role of coffeehouses in the Abbasid Empire was that they allowed for the free exchange of ideas outside the confines of state-controlled spaces. The Abbasid caliphs, while patrons of learning and culture, still controlled the formal intellectual institutions, and the intellectual elite was often composed of those who were in favour with the ruling class. The coffeehouse, however, was different. It allowed a space where ideas could be discussed freely, without the influence of political or religious authorities. In this way, it became a counterbalance to the more rigid institutions, offering a forum for those who might not have had the privilege of formal education or royal patronage. While religious scholars might have gathered in the mosques to discuss theological matters, the coffeehouse became the place for a broader range of intellectuals. The discussions were not limited to religious doctrine. They included the sciences, literature, art, and even politics. Coffeehouse discussions might include debates on how the universe was structured, the nature of the soul, or the role of the individual in society. These were not just abstract discussions. They had real-world implications for the lives of people in the Abbasid Empire, influencing everything from the way cities were governed to how people understood the cosmos. The presence of merchants in the coffeehouses also had a profound impact on the exchange of ideas. These individuals, who often travelled extensively throughout the Islamic world, brought with them knowledge and stories from distant lands. The coffeehouse became a place where trade was not just about goods, but also about knowledge. In a society where information could be scarce, and access to knowledge often limited to a small elite, the coffeehouse provided a much-needed venue for the free flow of ideas. These spaces were the nerve centres where ideas travelled quickly, moving from the scholarly to the popular, from the distant past to the present day. The coffeehouse also allowed for the blending of different intellectual traditions. The Abbasid Empire, with its diverse population and vast reach, was a melting pot of different cultures and ideas. Thinkers from Persia, Central Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even Europe came to Baghdad to share their knowledge. The coffeehouse allowed these thinkers to engage with one another in a way that was not possible in more formal academic settings. It was here that Greek philosophy met Islamic theology, where Persian scientific traditions intersected with Arabic medicine, and where Indian mathematical concepts were integrated into the broader Islamic intellectual tradition. In this way, the coffeehouse played a key role in the intellectual and cultural exchange that defined the Abbasid Empire. These spaces were not just places to relax or to drink coffee. They were spaces where knowledge was actively created, tested, and shared. The informal nature of the coffeehouse allowed for greater intellectual freedom and creativity, providing an alternative to the more hierarchical, controlled environments of the academy or royal court. The coffeehouse was a space of intellectual democracy, where ideas could be freely exchanged, debated, and ultimately refined. Ultimately, the role of coffeehouses in the Abbasid Empire was not just about providing a space for discussion. It was about creating a space for the exchange of ideas that would shape the future of the empire. The coffeehouses became the forums where the intellectual currents of the time were tested, refined, and spread across the Islamic world. They were spaces where knowledge was democratized, where thinkers from all walks of life could meet and collaborate, and where ideas that would go on to shape the future of science, philosophy, and politics could be born. As the coffeehouse culture continued to thrive in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Mecca, its influence began to spread across the broader Islamic world, eventually reaching the distant corners of the empire. What started as a local innovation quickly transformed into a widespread phenomenon, influencing not only the intellectual landscape, but also the social and cultural fabric of the cities and regions it touched. Coffeehouses became integral to urban life across the Islamic world, and their impact would extend far beyond the Abbasid Empire, influencing the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Persia, and eventually Europe. The spread of coffeehouses was facilitated by the empire's vast network of trade routes, which connected the diverse regions of the Islamic world. Merchants, intellectuals, pilgrims, and travellers moved freely across the empire, carrying with them not only goods, but also ideas, customs, and innovations. As coffee itself spread from the Arabian Peninsula to other parts of the empire, so too did the practice of gathering in coffeehouses. These spaces provided an environment where people could discuss not only the latest political developments, but also the scientific, philosophical, and literary ideas that were shaping the intellectual landscape of the time. As coffeehouses expanded throughout the Islamic world, they began to take on different characteristics depending on the cities in which they emerged. In Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the coffeehouse culture flourished in the 16th century. Here, coffeehouses were not only places for intellectual exchange, but also centres of social life, where people from all walks of life could gather to discuss everything from philosophy to the latest gossip. The Ottoman sultans, while often wary of the political discussions that took place in these spaces, ultimately recognised the cultural importance of coffeehouses and their role in the life of the city. The coffeehouse became an essential part of Ottoman urban culture, and the tradition spread to cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, each of which developed its own coffeehouse culture. The spread of coffeehouses also played a significant role in the intellectual development of the Islamic world. As the coffeehouse culture moved from the heart of the Abbasid Empire to other parts of the Islamic world, it created new spaces for the exchange of ideas and the flourishing of intellectual movements. In Istanbul, for example, scholars gathered in coffeehouses to discuss the philosophical and theological ideas that had been circulating for centuries. The intellectual cross-pollination between the Arab, Persian, and Turkish worlds was vital in shaping the ideas that would define the late medieval and early modern periods in the Islamic world. In Safavid Persia, coffeehouses became places where the ideas of Persian poets, philosophers, and artists could be discussed and celebrated. Here, Persian intellectuals would gather to discuss everything from the mystical poetry of Rumi to the latest ideas about the nature of the universe. The coffeehouse was the perfect setting for the free exchange of ideas, where individuals from different backgrounds could engage with one another, challenge one another, and inspire new creative and intellectual endeavours. The spread of coffeehouses was also deeply connected to the flourishing of Arabic literature and poetry. As the coffeehouse culture moved through the Islamic world, poets and artists would share their works with an audience eager to engage with their ideas. In Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, poetry readings became an integral part of the coffeehouse experience, and the intellectual energy generated in these spaces led to the birth of new poetic forms, themes, and ideas. Poets found inspiration in the lively conversations that surrounded them, while the coffeehouse audience offered immediate feedback, refining and shaping the poetry of the time. The coffeehouse also provided a space where the evolving cultural landscape of the Islamic world could be discussed and redefined. As the Ottoman Empire expanded, the political, social, and religious challenges that arose were frequently addressed in coffeehouses. whether discussing the tensions between Sunni and Shia Islam, the role of the caliphate, or the growing influence of European powers, the coffee house was a space where these important questions could be openly debated. The rise of new political ideas, the questioning of old traditions, and the exploration of social justice issues were all subjects of discussion in these vibrant spaces, where thinkers and ordinary people alike could engage in conversation. As coffeehouses spread across the Islamic world, they also began to influence the development of public spaces and social institutions. The coffeehouse culture played a central role in shaping the way that public life was organised in many cities, particularly in urban centres. In the bustling streets of Istanbul and Cairo, coffeehouses became essential meeting places for individuals seeking to connect with others and engage in the intellectual currents of the time. These spaces offered a sense of community and belonging, a place where ideas were shared and social bonds were formed. The coffeehouse's role as a social and cultural institution helped to shape the public spheres of cities throughout the Islamic world. This cultural expansion of the coffeehouse was not limited to the borders of the Islamic world. The influence of these spaces eventually reached Europe, where coffeehouses would become important centres of intellectual and political life in the 17th century. The first European coffeehouses emerged in cities like London, Paris, and Vienna, inspired by the model set in the Islamic world. In Europe, coffeehouses became centres of scientific debate, political discourse, and literary exchange, much like their counterparts in the Islamic world. European intellectuals would often look to the Islamic world as a source of inspiration for their own coffeehouse culture, adapting and transforming the idea into a uniquely European institution. As coffeehouses spread across the Islamic world, they began to fundamentally alter the social dynamics of urban life, reshaping how people from all walks of life interacted and engaged with one another. Before the rise of these informal gathering spaces, intellectual, political, and cultural discussions were often confined to elite institutions, royal courts, or religious schools. Access to these spaces was restricted to a small, select group of individuals, typically those who held political, religious, or academic power. The coffee house, however, offered a new kind of public space, where social and intellectual boundaries could be transcended. Here, ideas could flow freely between individuals of different social classes, professions, and backgrounds, contributing to a democratization of discourse that had a profound impact on the social fabric of cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Istanbul. In the coffee house, social hierarchies were softened. The rigid class structures that dominated everyday life in the royal courts or in religious institutions became less pronounced in the informal, welcoming atmosphere of the coffee house. While it was still possible for scholars, poets, and merchants to hold different statuses, there was no formal barrier to conversation. An artisan might sit next to a philosopher, and a merchant could exchange ideas with a mathematician. In this way, the coffeehouse created a space where social status did not determine the value of one's ideas or contributions. The intellectual and social fluidity of the coffeehouse encouraged collaboration and intellectual cross-pollination, in a way that was not possible in more structured hierarchical environments. Coffee houses became spaces where social and political boundaries began to blur. They provided a venue for individuals from different social strata to engage with one another, fostering conversations that broke through the traditional divides between the wealthy elite and the lower classes. For instance, in the bustling streets of Cairo or Istanbul, you could find a scholar discussing philosophy alongside a merchant discussing trade routes, or a poet reading verses to a group of enthusiastic listeners. This kind of social mobility, where people of different classes could interact freely and on equal footing, was revolutionary in a time when social hierarchies were rigidly enforced. The coffee house, therefore, acted as an agent of social change, breaking down barriers and encouraging new forms of interaction. The rise of the coffee house also altered the dynamics of intellectual exchange. Before coffee houses became widespread, intellectual debates and discussions were often confined to royal courts, religious institutions, and academic circles, where access was limited to a small group of elites. Coffee houses, on the other hand, offered a public space for the sharing of ideas, where anyone with something to contribute could participate. This democratization of intellectual life meant that ideas were no longer controlled by a select few, but were instead open to public scrutiny and critique. This open exchange of ideas, accessible to anyone who wished to engage, contributed to a more dynamic, open-ended intellectual culture. For the common people, the coffeehouse offered a space where they could not only socialise and relax, but also become participants in the intellectual and political life of their cities. Ordinary citizens, traders, craftsmen and artisans, who might otherwise have had little access to intellectual debates or political discussions, could now sit among scholars, listen to the latest news, and even participate in conversations about matters of governance, philosophy and religion. In a sense, the coffeehouse became a level playing field, a place where knowledge and ideas could be exchanged regardless of one's social status. This shift in social dynamics helped to foster a more inclusive, participatory society in the urban centres of the Islamic world. Moreover, the coffeehouse played an important role in the transformation of public spaces more generally. These informal venues, unlike the rigidly structured spaces of royal courts and academic halls, provided a sense of community that was not tied to class, wealth, or political power. The coffeehouse, in many ways, became a community hub, where ideas could be discussed freely and openly, where news could be exchanged, and where people could engage with one another in ways that were not dictated by social or political hierarchies. The coffeehouse culture nurtured a sense of belonging, contributing to a more interconnected society. The social changes brought about by the coffeehouse were particularly noticeable in the larger cities of the Abbasid Empire, such as Baghdad and Cairo. As coffeehouses became more widespread, they began to serve as focal points of urban life, transforming the social landscape of these cities. People from all walks of life began to converge in these spaces, and as a result the coffeehouse became a microcosm of the city itself, diverse, dynamic, and full of potential for the exchange of ideas and the creation of new social bonds. As these coffeehouses continued to expand, they influenced not only the intellectual culture of the Islamic world, but also the broader social order. By offering a space where intellectuals and ordinary people could meet, discuss, and collaborate, the coffeehouse helped to create a more egalitarian environment for the exchange of ideas. This shift in social dynamics was important not only for intellectuals, but for the broader public as well, as it helped to foster a more participatory and open society. The rise of the coffeehouse thus marked a significant turning point in the social and intellectual development of the Islamic world. It was a space where boundaries between different social classes were softened, where intellectual exchange flourished, and where people from all walks of life could come together to discuss the great questions of their time. As the coffeehouse culture spread, it had a lasting impact on the way people interacted with one another, and contributed to the development of a more interconnected, dynamic society. As the coffeehouse culture spread across the Islamic world, it became much more than a social gathering spot or a place for casual conversation. It emerged as a powerful catalyst for intellectual movements that would shape the course of thought for centuries to come. In the coffeehouses of cities like Baghdad, Cairo and Mecca, ideas were exchanged freely, and the intellectual energy of these spaces would go on to influence not only the Islamic world, but also the future of Western thought during the Enlightenment. The coffeehouse became a crucible for the development of new intellectual currents, providing a space where thinkers from all disciplines could come together to debate, challenge, and expand upon one another's ideas. One of the most important ways in which coffeehouses contributed to intellectual movements was by offering a space for the fusion of different intellectual traditions. In cities like Baghdad, where scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond converged, coffeehouses served as informal gathering places for philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and poets to discuss the latest developments in their fields. In these spaces, the ideas of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, as well as the rich intellectual traditions of Persia and India, were blended with Islamic thought. The cross-pollination of ideas that occurred in these coffee houses helped to create a new intellectual landscape that was open to the integration of diverse philosophical and scientific traditions. In particular, the coffee house played a crucial role in the development of Islamic rationalism. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, were engaged in the task of reconciling Greek philosophical principles with Islamic theology, and the coffee house became an ideal venue for the testing of these ideas. The informal nature of the coffee house discussions allowed for intellectuals to freely debate the compatibility of reason and faith, a question that had become central to Islamic philosophy. The coffee house provided a forum for the exploration of these complex issues, where thinkers could challenge one another's interpretations of Aristotle or Plato and refine their ideas in the process. The coffee house also played a significant role in the development of scientific inquiry. Scholars in the coffee houses frequently discussed the latest advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and these spaces became crucial for the diffusion of new scientific knowledge. The exchange of ideas about mathematics, particularly the work of Al-Khwarizmi on algebra, helped to lay the groundwork for later developments in mathematics both within the Islamic world and in Europe. In the coffee houses, intellectuals were not only debating the philosophical implications of scientific discoveries, but also exploring the practical applications of these ideas, which would later contribute to innovations in fields such as optics, medicine, and engineering. In addition to philosophy and science, coffee houses played a key role in the evolution of literary movements. Poets and writers would frequent these spaces, sharing their latest works and engaging with fellow writers and intellectuals about the power of language and the role of literature in society. The lively discussions in coffee houses contributed to the development of Arabic literature, as poets and authors honed their craft in an environment where their work could be both appreciated and critiqued. This environment helped foster an intellectual culture in which the arts, like the sciences, could evolve alongside one another, inspiring new movements in literature that would define the intellectual landscape of the time. The Sufi mystics also played a crucial role in these intellectual movements, often blending spiritual teachings with philosophical debates in the coffee houses. Sufi thinkers, known for their mystical interpretations of Islam, would engage in discussions about the nature of the divine, the role of the soul, and the experience of spiritual enlightenment. These conversations, which sometimes pushed the boundaries of traditional Islamic thought, were at the heart of the intellectual energy in the coffee house. Sufism's emphasis on personal experience and inner knowledge encouraged many to approach philosophy, politics, and religion from a deeply individual perspective, which further enriched the intellectual diversity of the coffee house space. The coffee house also served as a breeding ground for political thought, fostering the kind of open dialogue that would eventually contribute to the development of political and social movements. As people from different walks of life came together to discuss politics, philosophy, and religion, they began to develop ideas that challenged the existing political and religious orders. These discussions at times led to the formation of reformist ideas that sought to address the power imbalances within the empire. The coffee house became a space where the intellectual groundwork for movements advocating for justice, equality, and freedom could be laid. Importantly, the coffee house allowed for the development of what would later be known as public intellectualism. Intellectuals were no longer confined to royal courts or academic institutions, but could now participate in broader public discourse. In the coffee house, intellectuals began to engage with a more diverse audience, one that included people outside the elite academic circles. This democratization of intellectual life contributed to the development of new ideas that were accessible to a wider public. It was in these informal spaces, away from the rigid control of religious and political authorities, that intellectuals could test their ideas and push the boundaries of conventional thought. As coffee houses grew in popularity, they became key spaces for the development of ideas that would influence not just the Islamic world, but also the wider world. The intellectual culture that flourished in these spaces, one that encouraged open dialogue, critical thinking, and the blending of diverse traditions, helped lay the groundwork for intellectual movements in Europe, particularly during the Enlightenment. The emphasis on reason, individual thought, and the questioning of authority that characterized the coffeehouse discussions of the Islamic world would later be reflected in European intellectual movements, where coffeehouses similarly became centres of debate and intellectual exchange. As coffeehouses flourished throughout the Islamic world, they became far more than just intellectual arenas for philosophers and political thinkers. They evolved into vibrant cultural hubs where artists and poets could share their works, engage with their peers, and draw inspiration from the lively discussions around them. The coffeehouse was a space where the boundaries between different forms of intellectual expression, philosophy, art, literature, and politics blurred, creating an environment where creativity could flourish in all its forms. For poets, the coffeehouse was an especially important space. Poetry had long been a revered art form in the Islamic world, and its role in the coffeehouse culture was paramount. In a society where spoken word had the power to influence and shape ideas, poets found in the coffeehouse an ideal platform for sharing their latest works. Whether reciting verses on love, nature, or philosophy, poets in the coffeehouses were not simply performing for an audience, they were engaging in a dynamic, often intellectual exchange. The audience was not passive. They participated in the conversations, offering feedback, challenging the ideas presented, and in many cases, providing inspiration for new works. In the coffeehouses of Baghdad, Cairo, and Mecca, poets like Abu Nuwas and al-Mutanabi became central figures, not just in the artistic world but also in the broader intellectual culture of their time. Abu Nuwas, known for his bold and often controversial poetry, used his verses to challenge societal norms, celebrate the pleasures of life, and question the rigidities of religious orthodoxy. His poetry, which was often filled with humour and sensuality, resonated deeply in the free-spirited environment of the coffeehouse. In the intimate, informal setting of the coffeehouse, his works were read, debated, and reinterpreted, influencing a wide range of thinkers, artists, and even political dissidents. Al-Mutanabi, another revered poet of the time, brought a different flavour to the coffeehouse. His poetry, deeply philosophical and heroic, dealt with themes of fate, destiny, and the human struggle for greatness. His words were both a reflection of the political and social struggles of the time and an exploration of the individual's place in the world. In the coffeehouse, his works were shared and discussed, often in the context of larger political debates. His verses inspired not only poets, but also philosophers and political thinkers, making his presence in the coffeehouse a cornerstone of the intellectual life of the time. Beyond the poets, the coffeehouse was also a place for artists of all kinds to engage with the public. While the Islamic world had a rich tradition of calligraphy and geometric design, the coffeehouse provided a venue where these art forms could meet and interact with other forms of intellectual and artistic expression. Artists would often sit alongside poets, exchanging ideas about the nature of beauty, the role of art in society, and the relationship between form and content. The coffeehouse became a space where visual art and literature could influence one another, with many artists finding inspiration in the verses recited by poets or in the political and philosophical debates unfolding around them. The interactions between poets and visual artists in the coffeehouse contributed to the development of new artistic ideas. Artists were inspired by the flowing rhythms and deep themes of poetry, while poets found new ways to express their ideas through the images and symbols that emerged in the visual arts. This cross-pollination of ideas helped to foster a rich, dynamic intellectual culture in which art was seen not just as an aesthetic pursuit, but as a vehicle for intellectual expression and cultural exchange. Moreover, the coffeehouse played a key role in the development of the literary scene in the Islamic world. Writers who may not have had the access or privilege to present their works in more formal settings found a voice in the coffeehouse. It was here that new literary forms emerged, new styles of poetry, new narrative techniques, and new forms of intellectual expression were tested and refined. The The coffeehouse became the birthplace of many new literary movements, as poets and writers experimented with different themes, forms, and styles in a space that encouraged innovation and risk-taking. The Sufi mystics also played a significant role in the artistic and poetic culture of the coffeehouse. Sufism, with its emphasis on spiritual experience and personal connection to the divine, often found its way into the discussions and performances in these spaces. Sufi poets, like Rumi and Hafez, whose works explored themes of divine love, mystical union, and the nature of existence, were frequently recited in coffeehouses. The mystical, deeply philosophical nature of Sufi poetry resonated with many intellectuals, poets, and artists who found in it a way to express their own inner experiences. In this way, the coffeehouse became not only a space for intellectual exchange, but also a site where the sacred and the artistic could come together. These gatherings in the coffeehouse allowed for the development of new literary and artistic forms that would continue to evolve for centuries. The coffeehouse served as a meeting place for the most creative minds of the time, where discussions about the meaning of art, the role of the poet, and the nature of the creative process could take place in an open and dynamic environment. Artists and poets found in the coffeehouse a space that encouraged the free exchange of ideas and supported the flourishing of new, innovative works. The coffeehouse, therefore, played a critical role in shaping the cultural landscape of the Islamic world. It was not just a space for intellectual or political debate, it was a space where the arts could thrive, where new creative forms could be explored, and where the intellectual and artistic boundaries of the time could be pushed. Poets, artists, and thinkers found in the coffeehouse a place to collaborate, experiment, and challenge the conventional boundaries of their disciplines. In doing so, they helped to create a vibrant, multifaceted intellectual and cultural life that would influence not only the Islamic world, but also future generations of thinkers and artists. Despite their immense cultural and intellectual contributions, coffeehouses faced numerous challenges and restrictions, particularly as their influence grew. What had begun as informal spaces for intellectual and artistic exchange soon attracted the attention of political and religious authorities, who were often wary of the free-flowing discussions and potential dissent brewing within these public spaces. The coffeehouse, in its very essence, embodied an open space where people from various social classes and intellectual backgrounds could interact, debate, and challenge the status quo. This made it a fertile ground for political ideas that could be seen as subversive or radical, something that both political rulers and religious authorities found threatening. One of the key challenges faced by the coffeehouses was the suspicion and hostility of religious leaders. In a society where religious orthodoxy was central to social and political life, the coffeehouse became an ambiguous space that blurred the lines between the sacred and the secular. While coffee itself had been introduced by Sufi mystics, who used it as a way to stay awake during long nights of prayer and spiritual reflection, the social and intellectual use of coffeehouses began to cause concern among religious authorities. Religious scholars feared that the coffeehouse environment, which encouraged open discussions and the exchange of ideas, might lead to the questioning of established religious teachings. Religious leaders expressed their concerns that coffeehouses were places where people might indulge in sinful behaviour, including excessive socialising, gambling, or even drinking alcohol in defiance of Islamic prohibitions. These spaces, which were intended to foster intellectual and creative dialogue, were sometimes viewed as sites of moral degradation. The relaxed atmosphere of the coffeehouse, where people could gather for hours sipping coffee, debating, and enjoying music or poetry, was seen by some religious authorities as an inappropriate distraction from the spiritual focus required by daily life. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Murad IV famously took a drastic step to curb the growing influence of coffeehouses in the 17th century by imposing a ban on coffee and ordering the closure of coffeehouses in Istanbul. The Sultan's fears were not unfounded. He was concerned about the rise of political dissent and the increasingly vocal criticisms of his rule that were taking place in these spaces. Murad IV understood that the coffeehouse had become a place where political ideas, sometimes subversive or critical of his rule, could be discussed without the oversight of the court or religious authorities. In response, the Sultan not only banned coffeehouses, but also imposed severe penalties on those caught violating the ban, including executions for repeat offenders. The ban was a clear attempt to stifle political dissent and to restore control over the public spaces that were increasingly seen as threats to the authority of the monarchy. However, the Sultan's measures were ultimately unsuccessful in fully curbing the influence of coffeehouses. The demand for these spaces remained so high that even with restrictions in place, coffeehouses continued to operate in secret, and the culture of intellectual exchange persisted, albeit in more covert forms. Eventually the ban on coffeehouses was lifted, but the episode reflected the deep unease that rulers and religious authorities had about the role of coffeehouses in political and social life. Even beyond the Ottoman Empire, similar restrictions on coffeehouses were seen in other parts of the Islamic world. In Egypt, under the rule of the Mamluks, authorities took similar steps to regulate coffeehouse activities, fearing that the open discussions of political issues might stir unrest. In Mecca, the religious authorities took action against coffeehouses due to concerns about the gatherings of intellectuals and traders who were discussing matters of politics and religion outside the control of the established religious hierarchy. These fears were not without basis, as coffeehouses were indeed becoming centres of intellectual and sometimes political rebellion, challenging the prevailing power structures. Despite the attempts to restrict them, coffeehouses continued to thrive. Their cultural importance meant that their influence could not be easily eradicated, and over time, the role of coffeehouses became more accepted, even by some political authorities. In fact, the intellectual and cultural significance of the coffeehouse was so great that rulers and leaders could not ignore its impact on urban life and social cohesion. Even if they sought to regulate or control them, coffeehouses continued to play a critical role in shaping public discourse. While the political and religious authorities might have seen the coffeehouse as a threat, it was also clear that the coffeehouse was essential to the development of public intellectual life. It provided a platform for the free exchange of ideas that could lead to social and political reforms. Even when coffeehouses were forced underground or subjected to heavy regulation, they remained integral to the intellectual and cultural fabric of the cities. In addition to political and religious opposition, coffeehouses also faced practical challenges. As they became more popular, the simple, often cramped spaces that had once been small gathering spots became increasingly crowded. The demand for these spaces grew so quickly that owners struggled to keep up with the influx of patrons. The coffeehouse's role as a social and intellectual centre meant that it was constantly evolving, adapting to the changing needs of the public. The physical spaces of the coffeehouse had to accommodate an ever-growing diversity of people, from scholars and merchants to artisans and poets. This sometimes led to issues of overcrowding and competition among different establishments. At times, the rise in the number of coffeehouses led to the gentrification of certain districts in cities like Cairo and Istanbul. As coffeehouses became more popular, wealthy patrons began to frequent more luxurious establishments, which were often seen as more refined and less politically charged. In contrast, the more humble coffeehouses, frequented by the lower classes, continued to serve as centres for grassroots intellectual exchange, where more radical ideas could be voiced without fear of scrutiny from the elite. Despite the challenges and restrictions, coffeehouses remained resilient. The demand for these spaces, where individuals could gather to talk, share ideas and connect with others, was so deeply ingrained in urban life that they continued to flourish, albeit sometimes in clandestine or regulated forms. Their ability to adapt to these challenges ensured that coffeehouses would remain central to the cultural and intellectual life of the Islamic world for centuries to come. As coffeehouses spread across the Islamic world, their design and architecture became integral to the cultural and intellectual environment they fostered. These spaces were more than just simple rooms where people could sip coffee. They were carefully crafted environments that reflected the social, intellectual and artistic significance of the gatherings that took place within them. The architecture of the coffee house played a pivotal role in shaping the experiences of its patrons, encouraging the kind of open, free-flowing exchange of ideas that made the coffee house such an influential part of urban life. The architecture of early coffee houses was often modest but functional. They were typically small, low-ceilinged rooms, often with wooden beams and simple furnishings. The space was intimate, designed to facilitate conversation and interaction, rather than distance or formality. Patrons would sit on low cushions or benches, with small tables placed in front of them to hold their cups of coffee. These tables were often made of simple wood, though in wealthier establishments they could be more ornate, sometimes covered with intricate patterns or designs. The seating arrangements were deliberately informal, encouraging patrons to relax, engage, and share ideas without the rigid structure of formal settings. While the basic layout of a coffee house remained similar in many cities, there were regional differences in the way the spaces were designed and decorated. In Cairo, for example, coffee houses often had open-air courtyards where patrons could sit outside in the cool evenings, enjoying the social atmosphere while discussing the latest intellectual debates. These courtyards were sometimes surrounded by intricate arches and decorative elements, designed to create an inviting space that reflected the social nature of the coffee house. In Istanbul, coffee houses often incorporated elements of Ottoman architecture, with large, airy spaces that featured tall windows to allow natural light to flood the room. These windows were often adorned with geometric patterns or stained glass, contributing to the overall aesthetic of the space. The furniture in these coffee houses was often more refined, with luxurious cushions, carpets, and low wooden tables. Some coffee houses also had small stages for performances, where poets would recite their verses, musicians would play, and intellectual discussions could unfold. The Ottoman coffee house, with its emphasis on comfort and style, created an environment where patrons could enjoy both intellectual and sensory pleasures, an atmosphere conducive to creativity, debate, and connection. The most distinctive feature of coffeehouse architecture, however, was its use of ornate tilework and decorative elements, which reflected the broader artistic traditions of the Islamic world. The walls of many coffeehouses were covered in intricate tile mosaics or carvings, with geometric patterns that were not just decorative but also symbolic. These designs often incorporated motifs from nature, the cosmos, and religious iconography, offering a visual representation of the intellectual and philosophical ideas being exchanged inside. The integration of art and architecture into the coffeehouse space reflected the deep connection between intellectual activity and aesthetic expression in the Islamic world. As coffeehouses grew in popularity, they began to expand both in size and complexity. Some of the larger establishments, particularly in cities like Baghdad and Damascus, were designed to accommodate large crowds. These coffeehouses often had multiple rooms or levels, each serving a different purpose. One room might be reserved for serious intellectual discussions, while another might be set aside for poetry recitations or musical performances. In these larger establishments, the layout was carefully arranged to facilitate the flow of conversation and movement, with smaller, intimate spaces for quiet discussions and larger, open areas for group debates or public performances. In addition to the functional aspects of coffeehouse architecture, the design of the space also reflected the social hierarchy of the time. While coffeehouses were democratic in terms of intellectual exchange, there were subtle distinctions in the way that different social classes interacted with the space. Wealthier patrons, for example, might frequent coffeehouses that were more lavishly designed, with finer furnishings and more intricate decor. These spaces often catered to the elite, offering a more refined atmosphere where intellectual discussions could take place in comfort. In contrast, coffee houses frequented by the lower classes might be more modest in their design, with simple wooden tables and basic seating. These spaces, while less ornate, still played a crucial role in the intellectual life of the community, offering a place where ordinary citizens could engage in debates and discussions without the formal constraints of academic institutions or the ruling elite. Despite these differences, the architecture of all coffee houses shared a common feature. They were designed to foster conversation, whether it was through intimate, cosy seating arrangements or expansive, open rooms that encouraged the flow of people and ideas. The architecture of the coffee house was always centered around the idea of interaction. The layout and design of these spaces were not meant to separate patrons or create barriers, but rather to encourage a sense of community and openness. The architecture of coffee houses also reflected the role of the coffee house in social life. These were not simply places to drink coffee. They were spaces where people came together to socialize, share news, engage in intellectual discourse, and perform art. The comfortable and inviting design of coffee houses, with their soft cushions, low tables, and welcoming atmosphere, made them ideal venues for creating a sense of belonging. In a city where access to intellectual circles and political power was often restricted by class and status, the coffee house provided a space where people from all walks of life could come together on equal footing. The architecture of the coffee house was a physical manifestation of this social ideal, offering a space where ideas could flow freely and where people could find common ground despite their differences. As coffee houses became increasingly important in the intellectual and social life of the Islamic world, they also began to influence the design of public spaces in cities more broadly. The coffee house became a model for other kinds of public venues, such as libraries, salons, and even public gardens. The idea of creating spaces that encourage social interaction and intellectual exchange spread beyond the coffee house, influencing the development of public life in the cities of the Islamic world. The coffee houses of the Islamic world have left an indelible mark on global culture, shaping not only the intellectual landscape of their time, but also influencing the development of public spaces and social interactions for centuries. The legacy of the coffee house, with its emphasis on free intellectual exchange, social interaction, and artistic expression, has reverberated through history, leaving behind a tradition that still influences modern society. From the bustling streets of Baghdad and Cairo to the cultural centres of Europe and beyond, coffee houses have played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual, political, and cultural fabric of the modern world. One of the most significant aspects of the coffeehouse legacy is its role in the development of public discourse. The coffeehouse was a place where individuals from all social classes could come together and participate in discussions about politics, philosophy, religion, and society. This democratization of intellectual life, where anyone could contribute their ideas, was revolutionary in its time. It laid the groundwork for the development of the public sphere, a space where ideas could be freely exchanged and debated without the constraints of political or religious authority. The coffeehouse provided a model for future public spaces such as salons, libraries, and cafes, where people could continue the tradition of free intellectual exchange. The spread of coffeehouses to Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries marked a turning point in the history of public spaces. The coffeehouse quickly became a central institution in European cities, particularly in London, Paris, and Vienna. In these European coffeehouses, the same principles that had been established in the Islamic world, free discourse, social interaction, and intellectual debate, took root. European thinkers, writers, and political figures began to gather in coffeehouses to discuss the issues of the day, creating an intellectual environment that would give rise to the Enlightenment. Figures like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Denis Diderot frequented coffeehouses, where they engaged in the kinds of debates and discussions that would shape modern political and philosophical thought. The coffeehouse's influence in Europe went beyond just the realm of intellectual discourse. It became a key space for the development of modern journalism. Many of the earliest newspapers and periodicals were published in the coffeehouses of Europe, where writers, editors, and printers gathered to discuss current events and share their work. The rise of coffeehouses as centres for journalism reflected the broader role that these spaces played in facilitating the exchange of ideas and information. In a time when the flow of information was often controlled by the ruling class or the church, coffeehouses became essential for the spread of news, helping to create a more informed and engaged public. The artistic legacy of the coffee house also endures. The coffee house, particularly in the Islamic world, was a place where artists, poets and musicians could gather to share their work and find inspiration. The informal, open atmosphere of the coffee house encouraged creativity and artistic expression, allowing poets like Abu Nuwas and Al-Mutanabi to perform their works in front of a live audience, often sparking new ideas and pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in art. This tradition of artistic performance in public spaces continues today, with coffee houses still serving as venues for poetry readings, live music, and other forms of artistic expression. Many modern artists and writers cite the coffee house as a place where they first found their voice, or where they were inspired to create new works. In addition to its role in intellectual and artistic life, the coffee house also contributed to the development of modern social spaces. The coffee house was one of the first public venues where people could gather without the need for an invitation or the formalities of a private club. It was a space where individuals could meet on equal terms, regardless of their social status, and engage in conversation, debate, or simply enjoy the company of others. This openness and accessibility made the coffee house a precursor to the modern cafe, where people continue to meet, relax, and connect with one another. The social aspect of the coffee house, with its emphasis on shared conversation and communal experience, remains a fundamental part of coffeehouse culture today. As coffeehouses became more ingrained in European culture, they continued to shape the development of modern public life. The coffeehouse tradition influenced the creation of other forms of public spaces, such as bookstores, libraries and lecture halls, which became places for intellectual and social exchange. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the rise of cafes and coffeehouses in cities around the world continued to provide spaces for public discourse, artistic creation, and social interaction. The coffee house, originally a product of the Islamic world, became a global institution, transcending cultural and geographic boundaries to become a symbol of intellectual freedom, social connection, and creative expression. The legacy of the coffee house also extends to the political movements that it helped foster. As a space for open debate and critique, the coffee house became a site for the development of political ideas that would shape the future of governance and society. In the 18th and 19th centuries, coffee houses played a key role in the spread of revolutionary ideas, particularly in Europe. In cities like Paris and London, the coffee house was a meeting place for revolutionary thinkers and activists who sought to challenge the status quo and push for political reform. The coffee house, as a site for political discourse and dissent, contributed to the development of democratic movements and the spread of ideas about liberty, equality, and justice. Even today, the coffee house remains a symbol of intellectual freedom and public engagement. In the modern era, coffee houses continue to serve as spaces where people can gather to discuss important issues, share ideas, and connect with one another. Whether it is the local cafe where people meet to discuss politics, or the art gallery coffee house where creative minds gather to share their work, the coffee house tradition lives on as an essential part of modern social and intellectual life. The legacy of the coffee house is undeniable. It laid the foundation for the intellectual, cultural and political movements that followed, and it continues to inspire and shape the spaces where ideas are exchanged. Creativity is nurtured, and social connections are made. From its humble beginnings in the streets of Baghdad to its influence on the Enlightenment and beyond, the coffee house has played a crucial role in shaping modern intellectual and social life. The legacy of the coffee house, established centuries ago in the bustling cities of the Islamic world, continues to resonate in the modern age. Today, coffee houses are ubiquitous around the globe, influencing the way we socialize, engage with ideas, and consume culture. The core principles that made the coffee house such a significant institution in the past, intellectual exchange, artistic performance, and social interaction, continue to shape modern cafes, whether in urban centres or small towns. These spaces, while adapted to contemporary needs, still carry the same spirit of collaboration, discussion, and creativity that made the original coffeehouses of the Islamic world so transformative. In many modern cities, the coffeehouse remains a central hub for social interaction. People gather in coffeehouses not only to enjoy a cup of coffee, but also to engage in conversation, collaborate on projects, or take a moment of respite from the busy world around them. The modern cafe, like its historical predecessors, serves as a space where people from diverse backgrounds can come together, exchange ideas, and create connections. The coffee house continues to be a meeting place where friendships are formed, relationships are nurtured, and communities are built. Just as in the past, the modern coffee house serves as a centre of intellectual exchange. In today's world, however, the conversation has expanded beyond the realms of politics, religion, and philosophy to include topics like technology, sustainability, business, and the arts. Coffee houses have become informal venues for brainstorming sessions, casual lectures, and spontaneous discussions about current events or cultural trends. The informal, accessible nature of coffee houses encourages the flow of ideas, making them ideal spaces for innovation and creativity. Whether it's a group of entrepreneurs discussing the latest business venture, an academic meeting with colleagues to exchange research, or a group of friends sharing their thoughts on the latest political developments, the coffee house still serves as an incubator for ideas. In the digital age, the influence of the coffee house is perhaps more profound than ever. The internet and social media have allowed for an even greater exchange of ideas and information, but many people still choose the physical coffee house as the setting for face-to-face discussions and collaborations. Modern coffee houses, especially those in major cities like New York, London, Paris, and Berlin, have become home to remote workers, freelancers, and digital nomads. The coffee house has become a workspace for the modern world, an environment that fosters creativity, offers a sense of community, and allows for deep work in an open, dynamic setting. The ability to connect to the internet and access digital tools while surrounded by the creative energy of the coffee house has transformed the traditional coffee house into a contemporary incubator for modern professionals. Beyond work, coffee houses have also maintained their role as cultural venues. Just as poets and musicians once performed for audiences in the coffee houses of the Islamic world, today's cafes continue to host live music, spoken word performances, book readings, and art exhibitions. Coffee houses, with their welcoming atmosphere and cultural significance, serve as platforms for local artists and musicians to showcase their work and connect with the community. From open mic poetry nights to acoustic performances and art shows, the coffee house continues to be a space where creativity is nurtured and celebrated. Additionally, coffee houses today continue to serve as venues for political and social discourse. Though the issues discussed may have evolved, the coffee house still provides an environment where individuals can openly debate current events, express dissent, and challenge political systems. In cities around the world, coffee houses often host political discussions, protests, and meetings that allow for collective action to emerge. The rise of activism and social movements in recent decades has found an ally in the coffee house, where like-minded individuals gather to plan, organise, and engage in dialogue about societal change. Whether discussing issues of environmental sustainability, human rights, or political reform, the coffee house remains a space where political engagement and activism can take root. The influence of the coffee house extends beyond the immediate space in which it exists, as the coffee house culture has made its way into other facets of modern society. The concept of the open, collaborative space has influenced the design of co-working spaces, creative hubs, and even libraries. These spaces, inspired by the coffee house model, encourage interaction, collaboration, and the sharing of ideas. In some cities, the coffee house model has even been adapted into public forums where community members can come together to discuss local issues, share resources, and engage in problem solving. Importantly, the coffee house has also contributed to the development of modern cafe culture, a global phenomenon that extends far beyond the walls of traditional coffee houses. From the high-end coffee shops in cosmopolitan cities to the local cafes in small towns, coffee houses continue to be spaces where people can gather to enjoy coffee, engage in conversation, and relax. The global popularity of coffee and the proliferation of cafes around the world are a testament to the enduring influence of the original coffeehouse model, which continues to thrive in the modern age. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of the coffeehouse's modern influence is its global appeal. While the coffeehouse culture originated in the Islamic world, it has transcended regional boundaries to become a universal institution. From New York to Tokyo, Cairo to Sydney, coffee houses have become central parts of daily life in cities around the globe. The enduring appeal of the coffee house lies in its ability to foster social interaction, creativity, and the exchange of ideas, regardless of cultural or geographical differences. The coffee house has truly become a global space, a universal symbol of human connection and intellectual freedom. The legacy of the coffee house continues to shape not only the way we engage with one another, but also the way we work, create, and think. From the vibrant intellectual exchanges of the Abbasid Empire to the modern co-working spaces and global cafe culture, the coffee house has proven to be more than just a space for drinking coffee. It has become a space for the free exchange of ideas, a sanctuary for creativity, and a cornerstone of modern social and intellectual life. The coffee house has played a pivotal role in the nurturing and dissemination of new ideas throughout history. What began as a humble setting for intellectual exchange in the cities of the Islamic world has evolved into a powerful space where creativity, innovation, and progress are fostered. The connection between coffee houses and innovation is deeply intertwined, as these spaces have historically provided the environment for the cross-pollination of ideas, the collaboration of minds, and the incubation of new technologies and social movements. Just as the coffee houses of the Islamic world were centres for the exchange of scientific, political and artistic ideas, so too have modern coffee houses continued to foster the conditions in which innovation can thrive. Historically, the coffee house served as a laboratory for ideas, where thinkers from various disciplines could meet, discuss, and debate. In these environments, ideas that challenged traditional thinking were not only accepted but encouraged. Early coffee houses in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Mecca were places where scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers could test and refine their theories in an informal setting. For example, scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, whose work on algebra was groundbreaking, would have used these spaces to discuss and refine his theories. The ability to share ideas openly, with a diverse group of thinkers in an atmosphere free from academic or political censorship, helped accelerate the pace of intellectual advancement in the Islamic world. As coffee houses spread to Europe in the 17th century, the culture of intellectual exchange continued to thrive, contributing to the Enlightenment, a period marked by profound intellectual and technological advancements. Philosophers like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau gathered in Parisian coffee houses to discuss ideas of reason, liberty and governance, all of which would later form the philosophical foundation of the modern democratic state. It was in the coffee house, in these informal, often lively environments, that the ideas that would transform the Western world, ideas about science, politics and society, took shape. The coffee house has always been more than a space for leisurely conversation. It has been a catalyst for collaboration and innovation. In more recent history, the rise of the tech industry in cities like Silicon Valley has been strongly connected to coffeehouse culture. The co-working spaces that are now ubiquitous in tech hubs around the world share many similarities with the coffeehouses of the past. These spaces encourage open dialogue, collaboration, and the sharing of ideas among people from diverse fields. Just as coffee houses allowed poets, artists, and scientists to meet and discuss their ideas, modern co-working spaces allow developers, designers, and entrepreneurs to come together and solve problems collaboratively. In the modern tech industry, the influence of the coffee house is seen in the way companies and startups encourage creative thinking and brainstorming. Many companies, especially those in the tech sector, understand that innovation thrives in an open collaborative environment. This is why so many modern offices feature open floor plans, communal spaces and coffee bars, all designed to encourage interaction and idea exchange. Like the coffee houses of old, these spaces have become the places where new solutions to complex problems are formed, tested and refined. The informal, comfortable atmosphere of the coffee house is central to this modern style of innovation, which encourages fluid, dynamic discussions and the free flow of ideas across boundaries. Another key connection between coffee houses and innovation is the way they have contributed to the democratization of knowledge. In the past, access to information was often controlled by political, religious, or academic institutions. Coffee houses, in contrast, were spaces where anyone, regardless of their social or educational background, could participate in discussions about the ideas that shaped their world. This democratization of knowledge created a fertile ground for disruptive thinking. The coffee house allowed people from all walks of life to engage with new ideas and challenge existing paradigms. The influence of the coffee house as a space for the free exchange of ideas and knowledge helped to break down the barriers that had previously separated intellectual elites from the general public, allowing for a more inclusive and diverse flow of ideas. The cross-disciplinary nature of the coffee house has also played a critical role in the development of new ideas and innovations. Coffee houses have historically been spaces where intellectuals from different fields, science, philosophy, literature, politics and the arts, could come together and exchange ideas. The interdisciplinary exchange that occurs in such environments fosters creative problem solving and the synthesis of new concepts. For example, in a coffee house, a poet might engage with a philosopher about the nature of reality, while a scientist discusses the latest discoveries in astronomy. This blending of different perspectives can lead to unexpected insights and breakthroughs. Similarly, today's coffee houses serve as incubators for innovation in fields like technology, business, and social activism, where individuals from diverse disciplines come together to generate fresh solutions to contemporary problems. Coffee houses have also had a profound influence on the development of journalism and media. In the 17th century, as coffee houses began to proliferate in Europe, they became essential hubs for the development of the modern press. Writers, editors, and publishers gathered in coffee houses to share news, exchange ideas, and discuss the issues of the day. The very first newspapers and periodicals were often produced or discussed in these coffee houses, creating a space where the free flow of information could be disseminated to the public. In the modern world, the legacy of this journalistic tradition is still felt today, as coffee houses continue to serve as places where people can read newspapers, share news, and engage in the kind of social and political discourse that drives the media landscape. In today's digital age, the influence of the coffee house on modern innovation continues to evolve. With the advent of virtual collaboration tools and social media, the concept of a global coffee house has emerged. People now meet to exchange ideas not just in physical coffee houses, but in virtual spaces, where discussions about technology, business, and culture can occur in real time across the globe. Just as the coffee house once fostered collaboration and creativity by bringing people together in a shared space, modern technology allows individuals to connect from anywhere in the world, creating a global platform for the exchange of ideas. The spirit of the coffee house, its emphasis on the democratization of knowledge, creative collaboration, and intellectual freedom, continues to inspire innovation across all fields. Whether in the streets of Istanbul, the heart of Silicon Valley, or a virtual space, the coffeehouse legacy lives on, providing an environment where ideas can flow freely, problems can be solved collectively, and creativity can thrive. The coffee house, born from the streets of the Islamic world, has left a lasting legacy that continues to shape the way we engage with ideas, culture, and each other. From its humble beginnings as a place for intellectual exchange, political discussion, and artistic expression, It grew into a powerful institution that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. The coffee house has become a symbol of intellectual freedom, social interaction, and innovation, values that remain just as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The role of the coffee house in the Islamic world during the Abbasid Empire cannot be overstated. It was within these walls that some of the most important intellectual movements of the time were nurtured and tested. Scholars, poets, philosophers, and scientists gathered in these informal settings to exchange ideas that would go on to influence not only the Islamic world, but also the broader intellectual landscape of the West. The coffee house, with its openness and egalitarian nature, played a critical role in the democratization of the knowledge and the fostering of new ideas, making it an incubator for the future. The spread of coffee houses across the Islamic world and later into Europe signified the beginning of a new era of public intellectual life. Coffee houses became central to the development of modern public discourse, contributing to the rise of journalism, the growth of intellectual movements, and the spread of revolutionary ideas. These spaces were not just physical locations, but cultural phenomena that represented the power of collective thought and the importance of community in the exchange of knowledge. The coffee house was where the first stirrings of the Enlightenment could be felt, where the seeds of democracy and individual rights were planted, and where thinkers could challenge the boundaries of the past to imagine new possibilities for the future. Even in the modern era, the coffee house continues to be a site of intellectual engagement and innovation. The rise of co-working spaces, creative hubs, and the enduring popularity of cafes around the world reflects the ongoing influence of the coffee house as a venue for collaboration and the free exchange of ideas. Whether it's a tech entrepreneur brainstorming in a San Francisco cafe, or a writer drafting a novel in a Parisian coffee house, the spirit of the original coffee houses is alive and well today. These spaces remain essential to the creative process, providing a setting where people can gather, share ideas, and connect with one another in ways that foster innovation and progress. The coffee house has also shaped the way we think about social spaces. It was here that people from different walks of life, intellectuals, artists, merchants, and everyday citizens, could come together as equals. In a world where social stratification was the norm, the coffee house offered a place of inclusion, where ideas could flow freely without the constraints of class or status. Today, coffee houses continue to function as public meeting places, places where people can engage in meaningful conversations, challenge the status quo, and build communities. This sense of inclusivity and openness has been a cornerstone of the coffeehouse experience, making it an enduring symbol of democratic participation and social connection. The coffeehouse also played a key role in the development of public art and culture. Poets, musicians, and artists have long found inspiration in the coffeehouse's atmosphere of free expression. Today, the tradition continues, with cafes serving as venues for poetry readings, live music, and artistic performances. The coffeehouse remains a space where creative expression is celebrated, and where new ideas in art and culture can be shared with a wide audience. This role as a cultural incubator ensures that the coffeehouse is not just a place for intellectual engagement, but also for the appreciation of the arts. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the coffeehouse is its contribution to the exchange of ideas. At its core, the coffeehouse is a space where people can come together to discuss, debate, and reflect on the issues of the day. Whether it's politics, philosophy, literature, or science, the coffeehouse provides a venue for the free and open exchange of ideas, a tradition that is essential to the advancement of knowledge and the progress of society. The coffeehouse has always been a place where innovation is nurtured, where collaboration occurs, and where new ideas are born, ideas that have the potential to shape the future. As we move forward into the modern world, the coffeehouse continues to serve as a space where we can reconnect with each other, engage with new ideas, and foster creativity. The enduring popularity of coffeehouses around the world speaks to the timeless need for human connection and the desire for spaces where ideas can be exchanged freely. The coffee house has remained a symbol of intellectual freedom, social interaction, and artistic expression, and its influence will continue to shape our cultural and intellectual life for generations to come. The coffee house is not just a place where people drink coffee, it is a place where ideas are brewed, where culture is nurtured, and where society's future is shaped. Its legacy is a testament to the power of public spaces to foster innovation, creativity, and connection, and it will undoubtedly continue to be a space for the free exchange of ideas for centuries to come.